5 months into the war in Gaza and deadly chaos around an aid convoy has glaringly highlighted the desperation and climbing death toll among civilians.
The carnage of inhumanity is something we haven't seen for decades.
My guest this week on Conflict Zone is Nabeel Fahmy, former Egyptian foreign minister and longtime diplomat. At what point does Egypt have no choice but to consider opening its border to Gazans on humanitarian grounds? Have the shocking scenes of suffering brought this conflict to an inflection point? Nabeel Fahmy, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
Tragic deaths around an aid convoy in northern Gaza have highlighted the desperation of civilians for food and the lack of security in the enclave. After everything that you've seen in the past days, is it time for Egypt to open its border to civilians from Gaza?
The problem with opening the border to civilians is this would be participating in a premeditated, consistent effort by the Israelis to decrease the density of Palestinians on their own territory. And it's something which politically we will not do because we support a Palestinian state side by side with Israel. We continue to take Palestinians in need of medical supervision or medical help. We take those. But a large-scale number of Palestinians would basically mean we're playing into these very hands.
But, you know, Egypt has certainly made that red line quite clear that it will not accept any forced displacement of Palestinians. But how do you balance the humanitarian desperation? I mean, you know, Save the Children just out this past week saying that we are, quote, witnessing a mass killing of children in slow motion because there is no more food left. How do you balance that with your red lines?
It's an absolutely great question. We are in a very difficult situation. We cannot allow Palestinians to starve. We don't want them to be shot at. At the same time, we don't want to be forced into a position where we collaborate indirectly with the Israelis by decreasing the density of Palestinians. So what we're doing is providing as much assistance as we can through the border. We had an airdrop also just about 48 hours ago, and we continue to host negotiations with the Israelis and the Americans, the Qataris, to try to deal with all these issues.
But I guess my point is, you know, at what point does Egypt have no other choice morally than to open the border? Because, you know, we know this is not a crisis of your making, but does Egypt need to do more to help the people on the ground?
I think we are doing quite a bit, but yes, I agree with you. There will be a situation where if they're forced across the border, we will have to make a very difficult decision about how we respond to that. We clearly are not going to kill Palestinians. But that being said, it should not be interpreted as meaning push them across the border and we will acquiesce. Because pushing them across the border is not only a violation of Palestinian rights, it's also, by the way, a violation of the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. And that will have consequences.
Yeah, and, you know, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what is happening right now on the ground at the border, because there's been a lot of questions about that. Egypt has been building some sort of security perimeter at the border. Last month, your foreign minister classified it as what he called maintenance on the border. Isn't Egypt planning an area to house Palestinians in case of an Israeli offensive on Rafah?
In all honesty, I don't know exactly, but let me tell you what I do know. The area where there is construction was originally an area of unlicensed buildings. They were taken down and people were moved out. The government rebuilt that area and invited the Egyptians to go back to that area. They have not yet gone back to that area. And it's something that has been going on for over a year. You had the Gaza breakout during the last 5 months. So the pressure also became, what are we going to do if the Palestinians are forced across the border? We will have to deal with a very dire humanitarian situation, but we will also have to deal with a situation where we will not in any way, directly or indirectly, condone Israeli action that violates Palestinian rights in that respect, but also that violates the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. And that needs to be clearly understood.
Yeah, so let me ask you a little bit more about the diplomacy that might be going on behind closed doors right now, because I mean, Israel's foreign minister has said that they have to, and I'm quoting here, deal with Rafah because they cannot just leave Hamas there, and that it would coordinate with Egypt to address concerns about refugees. What conversations do you think are happening right now between Egypt and Israel, especially when it comes to, potential incentives, for example? I mean, money and incentives for Egypt to take refugees wouldn't hurt, would it?
This is not an issue of money and incentives. This is an issue, we are committed to a two-state solution. The Palestinian part of the two states is Gaza and the West Bank. If we were to reduce the numbers there, that would be very, very dangerous. Some Israeli politicians in the cabinet have openly said, yes, we need to move Palestinians out of Gaza into Egypt or even into Europe, and we'll find financing to do that. So that's their declared policy. We didn't make this up. But we have made it also clear that we will not participate in this process. And I can tell you that affects our national security. And that's a violation of the peace agreement.
Taking it back to getting aid in, airdropping of aid is picking up. Even the United States has joined in. There are currently discussions on how else to expand the flow. And, it's been reported that President Biden spoke last week with President al-Sisi about urgency of negotiations and bringing more aid into Gaza. I mean, as Egypt, you're next door, you're trying to get convoys in. Do you see the potential of anything shifting on the ground so that more aid can enter?
Yes, I do see. If there's a partial hostage exchange versus the incarcerated and a temporary ceasefire, that will facilitate aid going in. The most recent incident that we saw just 2 or 3 days ago, this was aid actually brought in and organized by Palestinians and Israelis. But given that it was a conflict zone, Israelis themselves attacked the group of people who had gathered around the vehicles there. So you can't have a sustained, substantial amount of aid going in a war zone, in a conflict zone. There's no really pure, secure area. So yes, why are we hosting the negotiations on ceasefire and hostage exchange? One of the reasons, stop getting people killed, but also allow for more effective humanitarian aid.
Right. And just to pick up on one thing that you said there, I mean, the IDF has actually said that indeed they did fire, but they didn't actually fire on individuals who were seeking to get aid. But again, there's two sides of the story. So I just want to highlight that that's the perspective that they are bringing in the official statement. Let's take it back to the ceasefire talks, because they were due, at the time of this interview, they were due to kick off in Cairo. Egypt and Qatar have been mediating between Israel and Hamas. And your foreign minister has said in the past days that he's optimistic about a temporary ceasefire being reached before Ramadan. What do you think that he sees that might point to optimism for a deal?
Well, again, you have to ask Sam himself, but let me tell you what I think he means. If you simply listen to the international rhetoric, everybody has been telling the Israelis and Hamas, let's have a ceasefire before Ramadan. They're worried about the situation on the ground, humanitarian and political, but they're also worried about it breaking out beyond the borders in the states on Israel's borders. So there's also the threat of expansion. That is what I think we're seeing. Now, again, 2 caveats here. One, this is not a full ceasefire, nor a full hostage exchange. This is a partial hostage exchange versus those incarcerated, and a temporary ceasefire. So it will be a positive step towards a complete ceasefire. You're not going to get resolution of the conflict or an ability to start rebuilding what has been destroyed unless you get a complete ceasefire.
But as one of the traditional mediators between these parties, talk with us a little bit about how you think the pressure on those parties might be right now. Because, I mean, we have world leaders speaking out loudly against the scenes of suffering right now in Gaza. Even the U.S., Israel's strongest ally, seems frustrated. Do you see this as an inflection point in the crisis? Do you feel the mood could change the dynamics on the ground?
Again, thank you for that question. I think it does, but it's an inflection point from either we start a process of trying to deal with the humanitarian situation more substantially, and hopefully then the politics, the policies, and the security situation, or the inflection point will be that we're going to move towards a highly volatile regional context. And I don't mean full-fledged Arab-Israeli wars, but I do mean you see everything from tension in the Red Sea to the Lebanese border, to the Syrian border, stuff in Iraq, what's happening inside Gaza, problems on our border as well. This is going to break out of hand. So the inflection point is either we find a way to slow this process down and try to resolve it, or it's going to break out beyond control.
So you've made the bridge there basically from the temporary ceasefire talks now to something a little bit more longer term. And there seems to be a lot of will and diplomatic momentum, we have to say, from both Arab states and Israel's allies, including the US and the UK, to secure such a long-term lasting peace that would indeed include a two-state solution. You know, you've seen over many decades all of the previous efforts that have failed. Is something different this time?
Yes, the carnage of inhumanity is something we haven't seen for decades. It was always a horrible incident inside Israel or among Palestinian territories, including assassination of leaders, by the way, not by the other side, but by their own people. So we've seen that. But to see 5 months, 30,000 people killed, at least, because there are those under the rubble that we don't account for, 70% of whom are women and children starving. We have not seen that in a very long time. So that's something which, frankly, I come from Egypt. We were the first to have a peace agreement with the Israelis. And that's almost 50 years ago. 50 years after the first peace agreement with Israel, to see not only the lack of conclusion of comprehensive peace completely, but to see the level of killing and counter violence is frankly quite shocking, and it really burns in my gut as having been part of this process for so long.
And as you are coming from Egypt, I'd like to ask you about this Saudi-led group of Arab states that includes Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, which is reportedly now pushing this post-war plan that would include a reformed Palestinian Authority governing Gaza, an irreversible path toward a two-state solution. From the perspective of Arab diplomacy, what could be offered to sweeten the deal for Israel? Because, I mean, you've highlighted the trauma of these societies, the violence, the bloodshed. There's no appetite right now for a two-state solution in Israel after October 7th.
That's why. I mean, let me talk about what I think can be done rather than what's on the table by the Arab group, because I don't know actually how far they've gone. I said crisis and conflict. We need to see. I'll give you 10 quick points in 10 seconds. Ceasefire, hostage exchange to the incarcerated, humanitarian support, security arrangements between Palestinians and Israelis in Gaza, including a withdrawal of Israeli forces, a declaration recognizing the Palestinian state based on 1967, Palestinian state under occupation, by the way. I'm not saying it's established. Palestinian state under occupation based on 1967, a reaffirmation by the Arab countries of their Arab Beirut summit, where they said they will all have relations with Israel if there is an end of occupation. I want to put all of that under a Security Council resolution. Every one of these points, by the way, is supported by all the international community. I want to have that adopted by the Security Council in an affirmative vote. And then we go to the parties, because that will also require, by the way, elections in Israel, elections among Palestinians, the establishment of the new government.
So then let me ask you.
And the Palestinians.
Yeah. I mean, it's you're presenting here a plan, but I also want to ask you how you get that plan done with the mood that is currently on the ground. The Israeli cabinet right now has said that any recognition of a Palestinian statehood in the wake of the Hamas terror attacks on Israel on October 7th, which, as we know, killed 1,200 people and 250 were taken hostage. They've said, and I'm quoting here, it would give a huge reward to unprecedented terrorism. What's your response to that?
We're not dealing with one part of the problem rather than the other. What I'm dealing here with is the whole issue. And I'm not actually asking the Israelis and Palestinians to accept it at the beginning. What I'm saying is that US, Egypt, Russia, China, France, UK, you name it, we've all supported two-state solution. Let's agree to this annotated package and go with it to the Israelis and Palestinians, showing them that, okay, you have a ceasefire, you'll have security, Israel will have security. Palestinians will have a relief from what's happening. You're going to have to establish a new government, the Palestinians, to deal with Gaza and the West Bank. So we're dealing with the whole thing together. And slowly, within a 2-year period, we can get there. If you go to the Arabs today, because I know this is probably on your mind, okay, why can't the Arabs take charge of Gaza and manage that and provide security? And that's a question which Egyptians have been asked for hundreds of times. It's probably the most illogical, irresponsible question anybody can think of, because we will not be surrogates of Israelis.
But
Israel has said they will preserve. Let me just continue.
But here's the thing,
They will.
But I need to follow up with you on that because, and ask you to actually respond to what Israel has put forward. They've set out this competing plan for post-war Gaza. It does not include a two-state solution. It does include overseeing security in the enclave. You've talked about security there. In fact, Netanyahu says that Israel should have security control over the Philadelphia corridor, we know. That's that border zone between Gaza and Egypt. Do you see any circumstances? You've talked about coming together. Do you see any circumstances under which Egypt would be willing to accept that?
Absolutely not, because that would basically mean.
So what are the alternatives from a security perspective?
This is my point.
Yeah.
Let me just continue. If you tell me that this 10-point plan or 8-point, whatever number of points you want, will ultimately lead to a Palestinian state down the road, then you can and it will not involve Israeli security supervision over Gaza. The Arab states are definitely ready to help rebuild, not alone, but they're ready to help rebuild and will help train and create mechanisms for better management in Gaza with the West Bank. But they're not going to be surrogates of Israel's security. There's absolutely no way that they would accept that. Furthermore, the reason why I said it's irresponsible, if we were to put Egyptian forces or trainees in them, we have a peace agreement with the Israelis, and the Israelis intervene militarily. What do? Shoot them? We end up shooting Palestinians and Israelis? It's not going to happen.
You've highlighted all the challenges, but what are all the alternatives?
The alternative is give me a structure for a plan, and then we can look at, okay, is security managed by an Arab international contingent or international contingent, Palestinian contingent with Arab oversight? The details are plausible, and we can look at creative solutions, but not solutions that end up with de facto Israeli occupation of Gaza. That can't happen. But I look, again, we were the first to sign a peace agreement with Israel. So that Israel wants security, we accept that. And we're looking at ways to achieve that, but only based on, you can't have security unless you solve the problem. The problem is occupation. And the Israelis want more transparency and more effectiveness on security. That we can look at, provided that the principle of ending occupation is there.
Let's move on because Egypt has been also part of this rethink of politics in Palestinian areas and part of the plans for potential governance within Gaza itself. How do you see the prospects for fragmented Palestinian politics to be able to unite after the war? Because the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is looking set to stay in his position along with his security chiefs. Do you think Palestinians will accept that and that the PA might administer Gaza he's widely unpopular.
Let me put it this way. The only way to really administrate Gaza in a way that's effective for Palestinians and ultimately also accepted by the Israelis without occupation is to have a Palestinian, a new understanding. Whether we like it or not, Hamas had less support before October 7th. Now they have more support, not because of what they did, but because of the Israeli reaction to what they did. That has, without a doubt, eroded the PA's authority, the PA's credibility, but we need to rebuild that. It may require new leaders. I'm not agnostic to that. All I'm saying is that, yes, you're hitting the point right on the head. We need to get Palestinians to look for a new movement. That's why I said we need elections and we need a new technocratic government to deal with both West Bank and Gaza.
There's a big debate also raging right now about whether or not, to what extent Hamas should be involved in all of that. Egypt, for its part, has acted as a mediator between Hamas and its foes, Israel and Fatah, as we've highlighted. It's also worked with Hamas in recent years to counter an Islamic insurgency in the Sinai. But, you know, for you personally, when you look at the situation, after the horrors of October 7th, can they really be part of a post-war scenario?
Again, it depends on the scenario. If it's a post-war scenario where we continue to have cycles of violence, they'll be part of it. There's no question. They'll be part of it because the asymmetrical balance
Even
of power
though many countries around the world consider them to be a terrorist organization, the United States, the EU, Israel itself.
Listen to me carefully here. I didn't say a post-war scenario where you have peace. I said if we continue to have a cycle of violence, they or others, other forms of Hamas, will continue to exercise what they pursue as their policies. What I'm putting forward is I want to rebuild a Palestinian constituency that is effectively supportive and pursuant to a two-state solution. If parties don't want to accept that, then frankly they can't qualify themselves, be part of that process. If they do, they will have to change. And let's also be cynically candid, if you want. Who are we negotiating with now? The PA? To get the hostage exchange. Who is Israel negotiating with now? Who is the U.S. negotiating with now? Who is it? Nice question for you. It's Hamas. So they are there. My issue is not whether they're there or not. They are there. My issue is how do I build a scenario that allows for Arab-Israeli peace, including Palestinian-Israeli peace. Those who don't want peace, we will then work against. But frankly, on the one hand, we're being asked to talk to Hamas, whose relations with Egypt were always very, very careful. But we're asked to talk to them now, and then we hear, but they're not part of the paradigm. Well, okay, so who should we talk to?
So then, I mean, you know, when you look at all of the scenarios that are possible coming out of this, first of all, how do you think the war in Gaza ends? And when do you see it ending? Do you think you'll see a permanent end to this conflict anytime soon?
I don't think you'll see a short-term complete ending. You will probably get one hostage agreement, temporary ceasefire, and then another. But then you'll have outbreaks from the agreement and a regression. Neither side really is ready to make a strategic decision, be that the Israelis or Hamas. And that is what is required. That's why at the beginning I said, let's put together a package that we outside the region, we beyond the parties accept. And then we start talking to the parties their center to see if we can sell this piecemeal. I agree with you. The sentiment today is not for a two-state solution, but actually it's the only one that will get them out of this process. As a former negotiator, do I think I can go and do it tomorrow? Of course not. But
and if a two-state solution
ceasefire
cannot be reached, then what? I mean, what realistic alternative do you see to a two-state solution that can provide peace in the region, or is there none?
There is none. The other alternative is a one-state reality, which will be a continuous conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, because they both want national identity on a very small piece of land, and neither side will give it up completely to the other. Furthermore, if you don't allow them equal rights, you will have conflicts within the one state. So a two-state solution is extremely difficult. A one-state solution is completely implausible. It is a one-state reality of continued conflict.
Fahmy, we have unfortunately run out of time. We thank you so much for joining us here on Conflict Zone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.